I hope that wherever you are navigating lockdown well at this stage. There is seemingly an end in sight. I know it's been long and difficult. So I hope that wherever you are, there's a little bit of light and a little bit of hope in your sense of where we are. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the country where we're all gathered today. I'm on Dharawal country, the country of the Wadi Wadi people on the south coast of New South Wales, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. We are anticipating that there will be lots of questions from you. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And the questions will come up, and at the end of our conversation we will leave plenty of time for those questions. We've actually had some questions come in already ahead of our conversation because so many of you are so keen to discuss this huge, complex and sensitive issue. It is also a highly emotive issue, especially I think in the way that language is used. Opponents of VAD call it state-sponsored killing, which does sound very sinister. Opposition to voluntary assisted dying is often based on religious beliefs. The Vatican, for example, calls it an evil act, that no end can justify. Again, the use of that word evil, very, very loaded. Of course, it is also a very contentious issue politically and ethically. As we've seen recently with the abortion issue in Texas, it's very easy for legislation to suddenly take away an individual's right to determine what happens to their body. Now, as many of you will know, last week, Queensland passed legislation to enable a voluntary assisted dying scheme to be put in place similar to the one that currently exists in Victoria. And this will come into effect in January 2023. The independent member for Sydney, Alex Greenwich, will introduce a VAD bill in October when Parliament resumes. Last time one was introduced was in 2017, and that failed to pass by just one vote. So it's pretty close. Okay, so with all of those things in mind, I would like to now introduce our fabulous panel of speakers for this morning. We have Andrew Denton with us, who is much missed as an interviewer on our screens. He's long been a supporter of the Older Women's Network. In fact, back in 2003, he featured a couple of members of the Older Women's Network, Louise Anarchy and Josie Jackson, on his ABC TV show Enough Rope. He's currently dedicating himself to the campaign for VAD through his health promotion charity, which is called Go Gentle, and which was set up in 2016 to help relieve the suffering and distress of Australians with untreatable or terminal illnesses. So good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Caroline. And I corresponded with Josie for many years after that interview. What a fabulous woman she was. And greetings to all from the chapter of Older Men.
Welcome. We have also with us this morning the eminent Dr. Elizabeth Evatt, who is an eminent Australian lawyer and jurist who has sat on many national and international tribunals and commissions and was the first Chief Justice of the Family Court of Australia and the first Australian elected to the UN Court of Human Rights. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Who also just reminded me that yesterday was the anniversary of the 25th anniversary of the first assisted dying death in Australia, a man called Bob Dent. So we are marking that retrospectively today. And finally, we have with us Professor Dimity Pond, who is Honorary Professor in the School of Medicine and Public Health at the University of Newcastle. She has a distinguished career pursuing an interest in mental health in the elderly and specifically dementia. As well as her research, she's maintained an active clinical practice, as well as serving on a number of government committees relating to aged care on aspects that include funding and dementia. So she's been very busy of late. Welcome, Dimity.
Right.
Are you there? Yes. Okay, I'd like to start with a few of the basics. So I'm just going to ask you, Andrew, to walk us through some kind of definitions and nuances, if you like. What is the difference between euthanasia voluntary euthanasia and voluntary assisted dying? Are they more or less all the same thing, or are there important distinctions there?
There is an important distinction. Voluntary assisted dying is generally when you are prescribed a life-ending medication. If you meet the criteria, which are very specific about terminal illness and how long you have to live, and it's a drink, and it's a horrible tasting drink, which you and you alone, as the ultimate act of voluntariness, choose to drink, and it will end your life peacefully and fairly quickly, usually within about half an hour to 3 hours. So that's voluntary assisted dying. Voluntary euthanasia, which Australia laws do allow for, but in specific circumstances, when a doctor, usually through a cannula, injects you with that life-ending medication. And that happens in Australia generally when somebody is incapable of swallowing or ingesting the medication as a drink. You might have something like esophageal cancer, which means you can't swallow. Some of Australia's laws now give the option for people who are choosing this law to choose one or the other, because as you could imagine, that moment, it's hard to think of a bigger moment than choosing to end your life. And for some people, the idea of drinking a medication, what if something goes wrong, that having a doctor there to actually take care of the process is of comfort to them. But that's the essential difference.
Okay, I remember one of the people that you spoke to in your podcast, Better Off Dead, saying that he had some limoncello that he'd saved up so that he would have it as his kind of chaser immediately after he'd taken his horrible swig.
Well, one of the many debating points raised against this legislation is, what if children get hold of the medication? Beyond the fact why anybody would let it out of the side, I don't know, and that it requires a series of medications. It does taste terrible. And one of the people I interviewed for the podcast, a doctor called Kristen Cornell, her father, who had motor neuron disease, almost his last words to her as he took the first sip was, "Oh, this shit will kill you."
That's great. Well, I wanted to ask you, I mean, there's the opportunity for quite a lot of dark humor in this conversation, but you've collected a lot of stories now over the years, I think starting back in 2016, of people who wanted to access VAD. And I'm just wondering what the cumulative impact on you has been of hearing these stories. I mean, obviously you come to this with a passionate belief in the righteousness of your campaign. So obviously your perspective is very firmly in one camp, but what has been the impact of hearing the many stories that you've gathered in the podcast?
Well, I'd actually put that the other way around. My being very firmly in one camp has come about because of the stories I've heard. The job of a journalist is to bear witness, and I have borne witness and been privileged to bear witness to so many stories of traumatic end-of-life suffering, which have rippled not just through families, but communities, and in some cases, generations. Sometimes I have moments, there are stories, particular stories, just when you think you've heard something, the most terrible thing you're going to hear, you hear something else. And sometimes there are people I meet who really stay with me. And I remember back in 2017, when Victoria's Parliament were going to debate this law, and there was footage on the news of the daughters of a man who I had met, a palliative care nurse called Ray Godbold, who actually had esophageal cancer that I just mentioned, who, even though he was a palliative care nurse, didn't want to die in palliative care. He knew what the end stages were likely to be. He had a legal medication, but he hung on and hung on and hung on, and he left it too late to take it. And he died the very death in front of his family that he had wished not to have. Anyway, I saw them on the steps of Parliament House when it was announced that the Victorian inquiry had recommended that Parliament pass this law. And I saw her there speaking to the cameras. And I was in a hotel room actually in Melbourne trying to write a speech, and I found myself weeping uncontrollably. And I thought, why this, why now? And I realized it was because to me, Ray and all the other people I'd spoken to, it represented such an injustice. The years that this had gone on, this suffering being denied or being made inevitable, and that something about his daughters having to stand there on the steps of Parliament House and say, now, please, can there be justice? It just deeply moved me.
I can imagine that. I can understand that. Well, that brings me to something that I wanted to ask you, Dimity. Suffering comes in different guises, and I was wondering whether you could talk about mental suffering, mental anguish, if you like, versus physical suffering, and how you discuss those issues when you are faced with a patient with a terminal illness.
Yes, so that's a really good question, Caroline. So I think for me, if someone is in a huge amount of pain that can't be managed with medications, it's fairly clear that voluntary assisted, and they request this and they're competent and all those other careful checks and balances, then it's very understandable that they would want that. They would want to die, and especially if it's inevitable, it's just going to get worse. But sometimes, and often, actually, palliative care is very good these days, and people's actual physical pain can be relieved. But there are other kinds of mental anguish that people go through towards the end of life, and particularly they may become very depressed, and there are things that we can do about that as health practitioners or family or community. When my husband passed away in the hospice, they used to have a happy hour and some drinks in the evening, and a little bit of a sort of routine that involved some pleasantness in life, and that was part of looking after people. And I think actually, as doctors, we don't always realise how much people are suffering existentially. Mm. So recently, I had a patient whose husband took his own life. He walked out into a stormy night, and he was very ill. He had a chronic progressive condition, and he wasn't found for a week, his body. Now, he was a very fastidious man who very much valued his autonomy. And the condition that he had was depriving him of being able to walk properly. He couldn't dress himself properly. He no longer looked, as sharp as he was always very careful about his appearance. And of course, he'd lost a lot of weight. And the look of your body as you come towards the end is often a big challenge for people. So these things, if we, as a group, GPs often get together as a group after something like this and say, perhaps we could have done this better or that better. And we hadn't really addressed those issues with him as much as we might, and with his wife. So it might be that someone who feels that existential anguish, that could be relieved and that needs to be addressed. But if at the end of the day it can't be because of the condition they've got and the inevitability of death and the loss of autonomy that goes with not being able to move and care for yourself, and the confronting nature of losing control of your bodily functions, which many people find incredibly difficult to manage. Then I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to choose voluntary assisted dying in those cases.
It's interesting because I think the two words that come to mind hearing what you've just said are the words agency and dignity, and those have tremendous weight, I think, in this conversation. But you used a phrase there, you said when the patient requests it, and I just want to clarify, would you like to be able to raise voluntary assisted dying with patients, or are you comfortable with the fact that the patient has to raise it with you?
Well, I believe the Western Australian legislation allows us to raise it. Perhaps Elizabeth's not. So I don't know what will happen in New South Wales. I haven't seen the draft legislation. You know, people sometimes need permission to talk about options, and there is an issue of human rights, of autonomy, of having all the information that they need, so from that perspective, I think it's reasonable for us to gently say, this is, have you heard about this? Would you like some more information?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would have no problem. It's not a question of laying it on anybody, of course.
Of course not. Well, Elizabeth, let's come to you for a clarification, because I believe that there are differences between the legislation in WA and in Victoria. So can you just clarify the point that Dimity was raising there about what you can and can't say and what you can and can't do in different states?
Well, there are differences. I think the Western Australian law is the one that has the most differences from others, and the one you've just mentioned is that doctors are allowed to raise this issue in discussions with their patients about end-of-life care, because it would be inappropriate to leave it out if you're talking about end-of-life care. Then another difference with Western Australia, because of their geography, is that they allow a nurse practitioner to administer the final dose when it's to be done by someone other than the patient themselves, because of the lack of access to medical practitioners in certain regions. That's another difference. They also, I think, have left out the requirement for specific training for medical practitioners. And then if a doctor or other health practitioner doesn't want to participate for conscientious reasons, there's an obligation to inform a patient who requests access to this procedure. You have to inform them what's available to. Those are the main differences. And I think Queensland has a longer period. Terminal illness likely to end in death within 12 months, whereas others have 6 months.
Yes.
Those are the main ones I've identified in this time, yes.
Thank you. Just back to you, Andrew, for something to clarify in terms of the team and the sort of technical names of all the people who are involved in this decision making. In the podcast, you mentioned some people called care navigators, and I was just wondering whether you could explain who care navigators are in the process and what their role is.
Thanks, Caroline. And I'll wrap this into responding to something Dimity raised before about the husband of the woman who's one of her patients who ended his own life and didn't really share what his problems were. One of the interesting things about voluntary assisted dying is it's a safety net, which in many ways currently isn't there. So when you apply for voluntary assisted dying, it's not as simple as I find one doctor, and that's not easy, I might add, and then another doctor that agrees. Generally, the first point of contact somebody has is the voluntary assisted dying care navigators. This is a team of nurses and social workers whose job it is to take that first call. Why is it that you're interested in this? They're almost like the first vetting point. And I interviewed a couple of them in Victoria, and they told me, just to Dimity's point, that on a couple of occasions they have referred people not on to doctors for assessment, but onto psychiatric help, because it's clear that their problem does not fit within the definition of the law. And what their job is on a human and practical level is to help people negotiate the process, because it's not easy. You have to meet very strict criteria. You have to pass very particular judgment by 2 doctors. In the case of Victoria, one of them a specialist. For instance, finding in Victoria, you have to have, if you've got a neurodegenerative disease such as motor neuron disease, you have to have not 1 but 2 specialists agree with the prognosis of 12 months or less to live. And in one instance, one doctor had to contact something like 30 specialists to find one who was willing to give that assessment. So the care navigator is there to offer support, to help navigate through the system. If you are, for instance, in a facility which may have an ideological objection to assisted dying, or some of its staff may. The voluntary assisted care navigator can help you, if necessary, find somewhere else to go, though that's not preferable. They are holding your hand all the way through. They are there to be rung up at any time if you have concerns about the process, if you don't know what's going on, if things need to move more quickly. You know, when is the medication going to arrive? They will intercede with the pharmacy service, for instance, who come and give the medication, and who, by the way, they're the last people in the chain. They also assess for capacity. And when I spoke to the man who runs the pharmacy service, Professor Michael Dooley, he said that on occasion they have delivered the medication to somebody who was in every other way legally entitled, but have decided that that person was not mentally competent and not given them the medication. So to Dimity's point, there are a lot of points in this process where somebody who maybe what they really need is psychological support and help could be directed towards it.
And just give me an idea, Andrew, of the time frame of this scenario. Let's say that I raise it with my GP and that I undertake the assessment process. How quickly can I be given permission to do what I want? How long does it take?
In strict legal terms, there's a minimum 10 days between your first and final request. That can be shortened if, in the opinion of both assessing doctors, your suffering is such or that it's so extreme or that you're likely to die before that period. But that's the minimum legal term. I think on average in Victoria, it takes about 4 weeks, but some people I spoke to, it took up to 6 months, and it depends where you live. If you're in a rural area, finding doctors who are willing to assess for this, particularly a specialist, is not easy, just like it's not easy accessing any other specialist medical service. You may just be unfortunate. Your local GP, who is usually your first port of call, may not wish to participate. I spoke to people, you know, the law says that if a doctor doesn't wish to participate, which is their right, they have to inform the patient within 7 days of their request. But I spoke to people whose doctors told them 2 or 3 weeks later, no, I don't want to do this. So I think part of this is it's a new law, and the medical profession and everybody else involved is learning how best to do it. But as I said, on average in Victoria, it's 4 weeks. I think we're going to see in places like Western Australia and Queensland, which are much faster geographically, there's going to be very variable times. And so that's part of the reason Queensland, their law just said 12 months, because in Victoria, what they found is fully 1/3 of the people that legally got access to assisted dying died before they could use it. Some doubtless because they didn't wish to, but others because they came to the process too late. So the idea is, the encouragement is not to die earlier, but to start the process earlier, because the point about the medication is, in fact, it is palliation. It is your, as Ray Goldbold, that nurse, said to me, your back pocket plan. I've learned there's a scarier C word than cancer, and it's cascade. And if your illness starts to cascade and things become very difficult very quickly, then you don't want to suddenly be having to race around finding doctors and care navigators and doing all the things that you have to do. You want to know that you're prepared, whatever happens, and you can make your choice.
Absolutely. So time is of the essence. I'm struck that there are lots of C words in this conversation, of which care is one and coercion is another, which we're going to come to in a moment. But just one more practical thing that I wanted to ask you, Andrew, before moving on. Who provides the training for the doctors who sign up for the scheme, given that the AMA is not a supporter at the moment of VAD?
Yeah, the AMA is shifting their position as we speak, but the training is provided by the health department. It's an online portal. Remember, the training is not training doctors to do what they already know how to do, and the doctors have to have a very significant level of qualifications already. It's training them in their requirements under the law, which are very, very strict. And in fact, there is no area of medical practice more heavily scrutinized than this. And it's training them about the things they need to be in particular looking for and how to look at those things. Coercion being one, capacity being another. Not that doctors aren't already skilled in these things, but it's putting extra emphasis on it. And those training modules are being prepared by, in Victoria, for instance, the modules on capacity were prepared by a very senior palliative care physician called Dr. Greg Pewitt of Ballarat Health. So medical professionals and health department professionals have prepared the training modules. And it's funny, a number of doctors I spoke to said, we hadn't done a test like this for years, and it was way harder than we thought. And they were a bit challenged by that. It was a bit like suddenly almost failing an exam at school.
Or having to take your driving test again.
Yes.
Elizabeth, one of the big things that gets raised a lot in these conversations is that doctors are bound by their Hippocratic oath, do no harm. And this includes not prescribing or administering pharmaceuticals to a person to primarily and purposefully end a person's life. So wouldn't voluntary assisted dying contradict this duty, this do no harm? Where do we stand legally on that?
You have to look at it more widely in terms of the rights and interests of the patient. Obviously, we most of our lives, we go to a doctor to help cure or deal with it, whatever problem we have. But in this case, a person is asking a doctor to care for them in a different way, to relieve them from an intolerable suffering, from which there is really no other relief but the end of life. And a doctor's got to look at that overall situation. I mean, in our Royal Commission 45 years ago, we really felt that doctors hadn't been adequately trained or prepared to deal with these end-of-life issues, and that doctors were left to make decisions about care, about withdrawing treatment or giving a dose which you know is going to be too much. I mean, will end life, if you know what I mean. And we felt that doctors should be far better supported and trained in this area, although we weren't able to go on and make recommendations in that area. But these laws actually do provide a framework for doctors to act ethically and in accordance with rules which make it clear that what you are doing is something that your patient desires as part of your care for them. If you turn away from that as a doctor, then you're leaving the person with their suffering, which you could help, but you refuse. So this provides a framework to do it properly with proper safeguards.
Thank you. I want to come back to you on the question of coercion in a moment, because it is a very vexed issue and it gets raised a lot. By the way, Elizabeth, if you've got some papers on your desk which are near the microphone on your computer, we're picking up quite a lot of rustling. Okay. So maybe don't move the papers. I'm not sure whether it's that or maybe that beautiful gold chain that you're wearing, but we're hearing a bit of a clink and a rustle from you. Dimity, palliative care. We've mentioned it several times. I guess one of the things that opponents of voluntary assisted dying say is that what we need instead is gold standard of palliative care. And I'm wondering, Dimity, what would gold standard palliative care look like?
That's a very interesting question. Thanks, Caroline. I guess, I mean, gold standard palliative care would involve a palliative care specialist who had a look at the whole range of the person's issues, and that would include relatively simple things like constipation, which is common due to the morphine and so on, but can cause a lot of discomfort. And you know, nausea and vomiting, and then pain relief, of course, and then there may be ways of relieving muscle twitch, and there's a whole lot of different physical symptoms. And then, of course, in addition, the psychosocial issues. So supporting the carer and addressing the existential, the mental health, but also the existential, those final question sort of issues that people have. Was my life worthwhile? have I wasted my life? You know. So that would be gold standard. And I don't actually think it can only be done by a specialist. I think it needs to be done by a team. And I think that team needs to include the family, preferably. And I mean that in the broadest sense, all the people that love that person or relate to that person, and bring different skills to that. So that would be gold standard. And that would include the GP, of course, too, because we often do know the person quite well. And we may have a different perspective and be able to, you know, have a chat about things that happened many years ago.
And would that, Dimity, in that gold standard that we're imagining now, that we're idealizing now, would there be a kind of integration then between palliative care and VAD as a kind of seamless continuum, rather than being presented in this oppositional kind of factional conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea, the aim for all of us, I believe, I mean, we all, you know, there's 100% death rate eventually. We've got over that problem yet, despite science. String theory doesn't address that. So all of us want to die a good death, I think, and that would be peaceful, and it would be fulfilling, and it would involve saying goodbye to your loved ones in the best possible way. And that's a process. All of this is a process. And that's one of the difficulties with dementia. You can't just say 5 years earlier, if I have dementia, I want to be able to have VAD. You need to be able to say it at the time, and you don't have the capacity with dementia. So yeah, so it would be a process, and it might be that there's been an agreement about VAD, and it might be that at the end of the day, the person still has a quality of life because they're being well supported, and they decide to just leave it a little bit longer, and then they pass away without needing to use that option. So yes, it's definitely a process, and VAD would come somewhere in there. And I don't think it needs to be an oppositional thing at all.
Now, you mentioned dementia there, which is one of your areas of specialty. So I just want to clarify that if I have put into my end of life care directive, that document, which I hope everybody watching this today has already got their care directive for end of life. If you haven't, please make a resolution mid-year. I know this is not the time for resolutions really, but think about having an advanced care directive because it's so important for your family. Anyway, so if I've got one of those and I say, in the event that I am diagnosed with cognitive decline, dementia, where I no longer recognize anyone around me, I lose the power of speech, all the other things that we know can be associated with various forms of dementia, not just Alzheimer's. Are you saying to me that if I say I want to end my life deliberately through VAD, there is no way that can be done at the moment?
I believe that's the case. Andrew gave the example of the pharmacist who came and said, no, this person doesn't have capacity. So I believe that's the case. And that actually honors the fact that we have a right to change our minds, that we live in a continuum, and what we think when we're young or younger may be quite different from what we think when we're older. And we see quality in life, even in those end stages that we might not have envisaged when we were younger. So I think that's good, but it is very difficult when the person with dementia has another condition that's causing suffering, whether it's shortness of breath, which may be the case, or pain, and there's been a few mentions in the chat about that, and then you would. So, Elizabeth, sometimes the law is a bit of a blunt instrument, maybe, but to say no, you can't do it because you don't have capacity when there's clearly suffering there and it's not being managed or can't be managed. That's difficult. I agree.
Okay, Elizabeth, let's go back to you again in terms of, the sort of legal nuances. I was mentioning coercion, and that is certainly something that members of the Older Women's Network are very aware of elder abuse. It's something that's very much on our radar now, and we talk about it a lot. The most common form of elder abuse is financial. So what protections can be put into law to ensure that people are not being coerced into making this decision? Or do you think, for example, looking at the Victorian legislation, which I think has 68 safeguards in it, do you think that the framing of the Victorian legislation makes coercion impossible?
I think it would be very, very difficult for coercion to be a real problem in this area, because we're not just talking about a vulnerable elder person whose relatives might want to get access to their money. This is happening all the time with fraud and so on. But we're talking here about a vulnerable elder person who has a terminal illness, who is facing death within months, who is suffering intolerable pain and being coerced to seek an earlier death. I just don't think this is a likely scenario. And in any event, even if that were to happen, the safeguards built into the legislation in all the states should readily ensure that the medical practitioners or health practitioners involved would very soon spot that this person was being maneuvered in some way. I think we shouldn't really fear coercion here.
Okay, well, that's very reassuring. Andrew, I'm wondering whether in the course of the conversations for your podcast, did you talk to people who'd applied for voluntary assisted dying and been rejected? And on what basis had they been rejected, if you met any of them? And how did they cope with that rejection?
I didn't speak to people directly, but I obviously spoke to doctors. All the doctors I'd spoke to had declined people, often because in Victoria, it's 6 months or less to live unless you have a neurodegenerative disease. And they would say to people, well, the good news is I don't think you're anywhere near that yet. So it's fine you started the conversation. You can come back. We can have this conversation again, but I don't think you're eligible. So in some ways, it was good news for people. I think there was one doctor I spoke to, a woman had a neurodegenerative disease. And again, the doctor didn't feel she met the timeframe requirements, and that woman was very upset. But it does, going to what I was saying before, this is a permissive law. And by that, I mean, it's not liberal. It permits a conversation which was previously difficult to have. So for that woman, I'm now hypothesizing because I didn't speak to her, but for that woman, and this goes a bit to what Elizabeth was saying about coercion, simply to go through that mental process to decide that assisted dying may be something that you need or want, possibly to discuss that with your family, and then to approach a doctor is difficult. It takes a real force of effort. There is an invisible 69th safeguard in this legislation, which is courage. Mm-hmm. It takes great courage to go through this process. And so for somebody to ask and be declined, it does make them focus very hard on, why am I feeling this way? Why do I think I need this? If this is not the pathway for me now or yet, or possibly ever, then what is another pathway for me? And they've already had that conversation with the medical professional, so it permits a broader conversation. And in the past, where this was not legal, there was not much to be said. You were unlikely to go to your doctor and say, I want to die. And if you did, you were more than likely to be sent off to a psychiatrist rather than the exploration of the actual lived and medical nuances that surround assisted dying.
I just want to remind everybody that Andrew's podcast about this is called Better Off Dead, because we've had a couple of queries about that in the chat. And I have to say that I listened to 2 or 3 episodes at Andrew's suggestion to familiarize myself with the terrain that we were going to discuss today. And I found the stories so compelling that I ended up listening to most of the series, because it's just So excellent. So I do recommend it to everybody who's here with us this morning. It would be remiss of me not to put some of the points that are raised by the very vocal opponents to VAD. I looked at a website called Hope. Hope being a coalition of groups and individuals that campaign against VAD on various grounds, and they raise various concerns. And one of the things that they say is that the most common underlying condition for those accessing VAD in Victoria is lung cancer, but that in 22% of cases, patients did not have a medical oncologist consultation before making their decision. So that there's a concern from some physicians that patients are seeking VAD despite the availability of effective and tolerable medical options such as biomarker targeted therapy and immunotherapy. So is it important that there be a consultation with an oncologist automatically built in to the screening process available to all who have cancer?
Look, I'm not sure where they're getting that information from, because Victoria's law says very clearly that one of the two assessing doctors must be a specialist in the disease from which you're suffering. So, you know, I've seen Hope stuff over many years, and I've gone down the rabbit holes over many years, and it's very questionable, a great deal of the information they put out there. And experts who they have cherry-picked and misquoted down the years have asked them to correct, and they haven't. However, the other reality is that if you have reached a point where you are eligible 6 months or less to live with lung cancer, you already have a string of specialists. You already have a string of scans. You already have a long medical history, which has got you to this point. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly have stage 4 lung cancer, or not unless you're very, very unlucky. And the assessing doctor not only can, but almost certainly will call for those records. They're not just going to take your word for it, you've got stage 4 lung cancer. So, and this is also, that proposition also suggests that people don't want to live, that people don't want to explore every option, that people don't want to take that extra line of chemotherapy, or those extra painkillers, or that radiotherapy, all the terrible things that you go through when you're dealing with end-stage cancer. And of course, that is a nonsense. It's one of the chief propositions that Hope, who, let's be very clear, are actually a group representing the Catholic Church, even though they don't declare it, like to put forward, the suggestion that people that follow this path, that somehow there was something else that could have been done if they'd just tried a bit harder, or just felt a bit better about their lives, or just had some magical spirit within them, which we could give them, then they would never have done this. Because, of course, from their point of view, it's about the sanctity of life, and they are welcome to that point of view. But this choice is always wrong, and they refuse to accept that people have agency and have necessity to follow these laws.
Okay, I'm going to put one more thing to you from the Hope campaign, and then we'll move on. They say that the Queensland bill is flawed in that neither of the two doctors who approve a patient's request need ever have met them before, and are not required to consult with the person's GP at any stage. Is that correct?
Well, again, it's a very clever thing to say. That may be correct, but here's why. What if your GP is a conscientious objector? What if your GP wants nothing to do with this process? You then have to go and find a doctor who is trained to assess you for voluntary assisted dying, which goes back to what we were talking about before. You actually have to be trained to do this, who is willing to assess you. So you may have no options on this. Ideally, it will be your GP, but it simply may not be a choice. But that doesn't mean the doctors take this lightly. Again, there's this implication here. They make multiple implications all the time. One is what I was saying about people who choose VAD. The other is about the doctors who assess this, that somehow or other they're casual about it, that they take it lightly, that they want people to die. In fact, they've gone as far as to say that doctors who they just want to start killing people is actually phrases that they use. This is not true. Doctors take their obligations to all their patients seriously, and this obligation more seriously than any other, not just because it actually is their sworn duty and their profession, but also because, as I mentioned before, there is very heavy scrutiny of doctors' actions under this law. And there are serious penalties under this law for failing to carry them out. So, you know, it's a clever piece of argumentation, but it doesn't stack up against the reality.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. Talking of legislation again, this was a question that came in this morning, Elizabeth, which was very much nuts and bolts. I don't know whether you'll be able to answer it, but we need to get an answer to it. Some Australian states have passed the voluntary assisted dying laws. Can you confirm that my superannuation and life insurance would be paid out fully should this be an option that I choose to take at some point in my future if I felt it was necessary? Do you know the answer to that, Elizabeth?
Oh, I don't, but I can't imagine that it should not be a problem, of course. It should not be a problem. You mean that an insurance policy might be voided in case of suicide?
Well, yes.
If the legislation hasn't covered that point, it certainly should have.
Do you know anything about that, Andrew?
I can't answer.
My understanding is that the legislation does not conflict with suicide insurance policies, because if you have a life insurance policy, it's only triggered by a suicide if you've taken that policy within 12 months of your death. Right. And of course, the maximum term for voluntary assisted dying is 12 months. So the two don't conflict. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Another question that came in ahead of the discussion is from a member who said, we know that there are people out there who have seen legislations put in place to protect vulnerable people's rights, which unfortunately have not had the desired effect. I can think of several. For example, the Indu card might be something that some people might cite. And they are very concerned that the VAD legislation will be no different because it will be run by the same government, which has failed miserably to provide adequate healthcare and aged care for vulnerable people. So what can you say in response to those concerns that the legislation is being put in place by people that this particular member doesn't have much faith in when it comes to these sorts of policies? Is there someone who'd like to take that on?
Well,
Andrew? Elizabeth.
The main actors here are doctors and others in the health profession, not the government. The government doesn't make any decisions in regard to the individual, though they, in some states, or perhaps all states, they've got an oversee mechanism, an independent agency that reviews all these cases to check that the law is operating effectively. So do we trust doctors? I thought doctors were among the most trusted professions in the world.
Yes, very good point.
More than lawyers.
More than lawyers, more than journalists, yes. Andrew, on that point, there's one episode of Better Off Dead where you canvass the doctors who kind of go on the journey from reticence or from being opposed to VAD. And I found that one of the most powerful and most, most deeply felt, I suppose, of the episodes. I'm just wondering whether you could talk about doctors who start on one side of this argument and come across to the other, and what it is that gets them there.
Well, in some ways, this strikes at the very heart of what we've been talking about, which is the role of doctors and the relationship between doctors and patients. The particular doctor you might be thinking of is an oncologist, Philip Parente in Victoria, who is profoundly Catholic, and his view on the sanctity of life obviously informed by the Vatican. He's so Catholic, he laughed and said, my wife is Mary, my son is Joseph. And he said, I was a conscientious objector to this law, and I just referred people on, as was his right. And I'll preface what I'm about to say by saying, I think just like every individual patient must make that choice, and this, so must every doctor. I never criticize a doctor who has a conscientious objection. I only criticize them if they obstruct somebody making this choice. Anyway, Philip, as an oncologist, he got requests he would refer them on, and he began to question. He said, I pride myself on seeing my patients all the way through their journey, even to death, And I know that if I've done that, I've done a good job. Yet here I am, people reaching a critical moment in their treatment, and I'm turning them away. He took time off from his work. He did an ethics course, and he sat down with his wife, Mary, and said, I think I'm doing the wrong thing. And he now assesses people for VAD, and he talked very movingly about the first person he assessed, who was if I recall, a young woman. And he said, I learned so much from her bravery, and I felt really good that I had done the right thing. I'd seen my patient all the way through. I see doctors, there's no bright shining line with any of this, Caroline. Death is just 1,000 shades of grey. And I've seen doctors who pursue this, but who still find it emotionally very draining, particularly if they're the doctors who are administering that medication rather than just prescribing it. It's a very hard thing to do. A doctor I spoke to in the Netherlands, the first person she ever euthanized, who she'd known for years, a woman with cancer, she knew that she had ended her suffering and she saw how grateful she was. But when it was over, she collapsed weeping in the corridor afterwards. And she said to me, and I've never forgotten it, she said, it really costs you. And one of the things that surprised me, I didn't expect to find as I got into this 6 years ago, I assumed the medical profession were conversant with death. You know, that's part of the gig. But hey, newsflash, doctors are humans just like us, and we all fear death, and we all come to it differently, and we all have our own personal dynamics. And so there's no easy bit about this conversation. Whether you're for VAD or against it, there's no easy bit about dying. People die as they live. Life is complicated, so is death.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say, you know, newsflash, they're not kind of across death. If you're a woman, I don't think that comes as a surprise to you, Andrew, because you only have to look at the neglect of women's health on really fundamental subjects like menopause to know that there are huge spots in blank spots, rather, you know, chasms in doctors' training in terms of what are elective subjects and what are absolutely core subjects. So nothing surprises us. Dimity, I want to ask you a question which has come up in the questions from those who are watching, which is, can you comment on the use of sodium nitrate as a cheap and effective option? I've lost where this question has come from. Is sodium nitrate, what is sodium nitrate, Dimity?
I can't comment on it because I just don't know about sodium nitrate. There are nitrates that we use in medicine, chiefly for heart problems, but I don't know about sodium nitrate specifically.
Okay, all right. Well, as long as it's not one of those cockamamie.
Caroline,
yes.
could I just leap in very quickly and say, I can't speak to sodium nitrate either, except I do know from talking to Professor Michael Dooley, who runs the statewide pharmacy service, that this is not something you want to dabble in, that in fact it took a great deal of research to work out the right mix. I believe it's there's some pentobarbital. I don't know the mix, I'm not a chemist. So I would say as a blanket, no, I wouldn't be dabbling. I wouldn't be trying stuff out. I think this is for very experienced professionals.
Yes. Okay. Well, yes. And I mean, we can take our cue there from all the sort of cockamamie lunatic ideas about alternatives to the vaccine for COVID. So it's, yes, you know, handle with care, I think is the motto there. Another question that's come up, which I think is for Elizabeth: how can people support the bill that is about to be presented in the New South Wales Parliament? What can we do as citizens?
Well, if you want to support the New South Wales legislation, first of all, you can write to your member to say that you support it and hope that the member will vote in favour of it. You can, as I did last time, you can go up on the day when the bill comes up and demonstrate with other members of DWD to show a big crowd support. I think that's really covers it. You can write to the Premier, you can write to everybody.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll get
friends and get your friends to do the same.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get on it today. There's been a response from Penny from Dying with Dignity, and she's just clarified the life insurance question, which is that there are specific provisions in the legislation to ensure that that is not affected. So that confirms what you said, Elizabeth.
I would have thought that is.
Let me just scroll through and see if there are any other very urgent. Oh, the sodium nitrate. Yes, I see that. Dying with Dignity also says it's a do-it-yourself substance and leads to a painful death. So we don't recommend that. Andrew, do you know why the cocktail tastes so horrible? Why can't they make it nice?
You know, one of the most surprising part of the year of conversations I had preparing the podcast was with Professor Michael Dooley. And I said, am I right? From what I'm hearing, this tastes somewhere between shithouse and absolutely shithouse. And he said, definitely, that's the feedback we've had. But he said, we taste tested it. And I said, what? What do you mean you taste tested it? He said, we have to. This is what we do. We're chemists. So we all took, and he said, we tried everything we could to work out a way to make it taste not so foul. And there was really no way to do it, you know, other than to dilute it, and you'd have to swallow gallons, which is, of course, unfeasible. So they recommend people the limoncello chaser, that they have a chaser with them. And but it's you know, it's one of the reasons, were it ever somehow or other to be magically lying around the house mixed up and ready to go, no, that would never happen. But it's why you never need to worry about a kid drinking it, because it's the worst tasting thing apparently in the world ever.
Excellent. Okay. Given everything that we've said so far, Dimity, and we're just coming to the end of our time together, and given what you said before about gold standard palliative care, can you imagine the terms of eligibility for this kind of legislation widening over time to include more conditions? So perhaps, you know, dementia is always going to be a particular sticking point and particularly difficult to include. But can you imagine a day where it's not just those with terminal illness with a great deal of pain who are going to die in the next 6 to 12 months, but say someone who has gone blind, lives alone, needs assistance with personal care, and has just had enough and can say that in a very clear and deliberate way?
Yes, I can imagine it. I think there'd have to be a lot of checks and balances there too. And, you know, a trial of psychological therapy. But I can imagine that. And especially a very elderly person. Yes, I think this is a continuing discussion. I was actually on a panel at a conference that was based in the Netherlands, but I was from Sydney on the panel this year. And we were talking about ethical issues in aged care and how to talk about advanced care planning, for example, in the case of someone just diagnosed with dementia. And we had some good discussions about that, and the issue about voluntary assisted dying came up as well. And of course, the panelists were quite happy to talk about it, being from the Netherlands. So, that was it was really interesting to see how open people were to that discussion and how to improve quality of life at the end of life. And I think if that outcome can come from these discussions as well, that would be a wonderful thing.
Well, that at least is some kind of note of optimism on which to end. And I do think that it gives us the example of how possibly to think about a good life involving a good death. And it's great that there are countries where this has progressed to the extent that you've just mentioned. We have come to the end of our time together. I would like to thank you all, panelists, for being so candid and so generous with your time and your knowledge this morning. Thank you, Dimity, Elizabeth, and Andrew. Thank you all for watching in such great numbers. We're dipping our toe into this conversation, and given the demand, I think that it is a given that we will continue these conversations, and we will make sure that we have representatives from palliative care in the next conversation that we curate. I'd like to thank the Older Women's Network team, particularly Yumi and Christine, for putting this session together. Just a couple of things. I often find that the easiest way in for me to some big ideas that I'm kind of trying to work through is through fiction. And the very controversial novelist Lionel Shriver has a new novel out at the moment called Should We Stay or Should We Go? So I don't know what her position is. I can kind of guess what her position is, but that might be a way in for some of you. And if you haven't already read it, there's a palliative care nurse in Melbourne who's also a novelist called Stephen Amsterdam, who wrote a brilliant novel about this from the point of view of a gay male nurse administering lethal doses to patients in a future time. And that novel is called The Easy Way Out. This forum will be up on our website for you to view and share next week. And also next week, we've got a terrific panel discussion on momentum for social change with Emma Dawson, Hayley Foster, and other terrific campaigners and advocates. So you can look for that on our website. And on the 1st of October, which is International AIDS Awareness Day, I will be in conversation with Linda Burney and US anti-ageism firebrand, Ashton Applewhite, who really knows how to put a fire in your belly for reform and for living life to the fullest, no matter how old you are. So hope to see you all then. Stay safe and get vaccinated. Thank you.